So without further ado, please give a warm welcome for Mr. Jeff Mann.
Thanks, Jeremy. That's pretty much all we have time for, so I guess it's lunchtime. Title of the talk is More Tales from the Crypt Analyst. Several years ago, I was at a conference, and I can show you my info while I'm telling you this story. I was at a conference, I met another speaker, and at some point I asked him what he was talking about. He said, oh, I'm going to do a talk on intro to cryptography. I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. Cryptography is kind of a thing I'm into. So I went to his talk the next day, and as I'm listening to him do this basic overview, Cryptography 101, I thought, wow, I could give a talk like this. I lived this. So a couple years ago at GrrCON, I premiered a talk called Tales from the Crypt Analyst, which was basically the story of the first several years of my time at NSA, my tenure at NSA. And I always promised a sequel, which is essentially the essence of this talk today. Real quickly, just to get the acknowledgments out of the way, I work for a consulting company called Online Business Systems. We're mostly a consultancy advisory company. We do a lot of the pen testing type of stuff, and we do PCI work as well as other compliance. But before your eyes roll back in your head, what we really try to do is, as experts, we come in and try to help companies figure out how to do security, do it right for them, do it the way that gets them to a place where they can be compliant and get the regulators off their backs, but more importantly, just become more secure. My background, very briefly, which Jeremy sort of stole my thunder, but that's okay. I'm not bitter or anything. I've been in the business a long time, sort of from the beginning, if you will. I spent my formative years working for the DoD, primarily with NSA, and left the NSA about 23 years ago. Why, you're going to hear today in basically the crux of this presentation. Been out in the private sector, trying to make the world a better place, one company at a time, trying to help them be secure. Somewhere along the line, I fell into PCI, but I actually kind of like PCI because when I was first introduced to PCI, the data security standard, it was presented to me as this is a framework or this is a measuring stick for how organizations should be doing security at their companies with an emphasis on a particular type of data. And I read it and I said, yeah, this makes sense. This is kind of what I've learned over the years from the DoD. Let's go do it. That's another story for another day. So the crux of this story today is I had basically 3 tours of duty at NSA, and I'll get into the details of that, but the third tour of duty, as Jeremy alluded to, is when I got into pen testing and started doing that for NSA. We didn't call it red teaming back then. And that's sort of the gist of this story today. So sit back, relax. If your stomach's grumbling, lunch is afterwards, but hopefully we will be entertained over the next hour or so. I first want to apologize. As I was first putting this talk together and trying to think about what we did 25 some odd years ago in terms of pen testing and what did the internet look like, what did the world look like, I discovered that trying to find entertaining screenshots for this talk was a little bit daunting. So apologies in advance. I think I did a pretty decent job, but certainly what we had available then and actually trying to find it and bring it forward to the future was a little bit daunting. I also want to make this talk a little bit audience participatory, so there's going to be times through the presentation where dates will pop up, and the challenge to you is to try to answer what is the significance, what is the meaning, what is important about the date. It's a little bit of history, it's a little bit of putting things in terms of a context and a timeline of what existed and what didn't during the time, in particular when I was at NSA starting to do pen testing. So let's start off with an exercise. In fact, I have 2. This one is my special Raleigh-Durham edition of this test. Anybody have any idea what this date's about? I'm not going to give you much time to guess because I got a lot of slides to cover. Give up? This is the original release date of probably arguably the best baseball movie ever made, Bull Durham. And actually a movie that years later still gives us a very important lesson which I used to use all the time, still do. Don't think, just pitch. One more date. Anybody else? Anybody? 3, 2, 1. Okay, so you get the idea. Actually, I've done this talk for audiences that have no idea what Skynet actually is, which is a little bit disturbing. So I apologize in advance. If I do movie references or things like that, they might be a little bit dated if you're a younger audience. Actually, out of curiosity, how many people, raise your hand, are, let's say, 37 years old or younger? Okay, I've been doing this your entire life, just to put that in context. And yes, that does make me feel old. Another little wrinkle that I've added to this talk in the last couple months is to try to put an emphasis on mental health hacking. We've had a lot of issues within our community of people getting burned out and people going to extreme lengths to try to end the pain. So I want to, as I'm telling the story of what I was doing many years ago, trying to become a hacker and pen tester and things like that, I want to overlay that with the fact that I had a real life. So I'm going to bore you with a bunch of family photos, but the emphasis is don't forget, whatever your passion is, whatever you're doing for your day job or your interests, don't forget to step away from it and actually have a life, whatever that may be. So I will bore you with some family photos. So anyway, getting into it. I was at NSA approximately 10 years, from 1986 to 1996. During that time, I did several different things, but boils down to primarily cryptography. And I actually worked, at the time there was two sides to NSA, what we loosely called offense and defense. The offense is what most people think of when they think of NSA. It's communications intelligence, signals intelligence, intercepting the communications of our adversaries and other countries and nation states. I worked on that side of the house, breaking codes, breaking ciphers. I was also on the defensive side, which is what we called InfoSec at the time, actually designing and creating secure codes and ciphers. And then later on, obviously got into the pen testing thing. I mentioned there's an original version 1 of this talk, Tales from the Crypt Analyst, where I go into more detail of sort of the early years and things I did. But I do want to highlight a few of the things that I did there as they apply to sort of the formative things, events that occurred in my career at NSA, which helped me to realize that I was actually a hacker. I actually believe you're a kind of a hacker from birth, because to me, hacking is sort of a state of mind. It's a way of viewing things. And for better or for worse, I view the world differently than most. So, very early experience at NSA, I was working for the manual crypto systems shop. We were responsible for putting out all the paper cipher systems, primarily one-time pads, mostly for the armed forces. I had a customer approach me very early on and say, it takes us hours to do the one-time pad decryption, but there's this thing on our desk called a PC. Is there any way we could use that to speed up the process? And I thought, well, yeah, that's something that we could do. That seems reasonable. So to make a long story short, produced what I am still to this day, I believe, is the first software-based encryption product that NSA produced. And all it did was take a one-time pad, and on one end it was paper, on the other end it was a floppy disk. And we wrote a program that would run on the computer that would do the encryption and decryption a page at a time, securely delete that page, and move forward. I had to go through, and this is where it kind of gets into the methodologies and sort of thinking about pen testing. I had to go through a compliance process, if you will, or an SDLC process. It was called FSRS in those days, Functional Security Requirements Specification. These specifications were written for hardware. Back in those days, there was no such thing as software-based cryptography or online digital, anything like that. It was all basically radios and things that would attach to radios that would convert signals, voices, and possibly like Morse code and things like that. But it was not digital in any way, shape, or form, at least the way we think of it today. So I had to take hardware specs and try to follow them, but make them applicable to what we were doing, which was software-based. So I basically had to hack the requirement specifications. This did not go over terribly well. I had to go through a review process and basically sit in front of the board of directors, if you will, the equivalent C-level type of people that were running the entire InfoSec side of the house. And they begrudgingly had to acknowledge that I met the requirements the way they were written. At least they couldn't talk me out of it, or they couldn't find an argument not to go forward. So they granted me the permission to publish, produce this software-based system. But the last thing that the senior head guy said to me was, "Don't do this again." Another fun thing I did, which was for another customer, again using one-time pads, happened to be U.S. Special Forces. They used a particular one-time pad that, as their algorithm, if you will, they used something called a Visionnaire Table, which is a slide of the alphabet, 26 different offsets, but using a reverse alphabet in the body of the table. This produces 123 unique three-letter combinations, three-letter trigraphs, we call them. So think of it plain text, key, and cipher. In any order, you got 2 letters, there's always a unique third letter. So that enabled the encryption process with a one-time pad. They memorized it, I didn't. As a crux for me, I had just gone through an intro to crypto class, learned about a cipher wheel, and I thought there must be a way to do a cipher wheel with this Visionnaire table. So I came up with this wheel. They liked it so much, they stole it from me every time I made one. So I ended up asking them, would you like us to make these things? So we produced like 15,000 of these wheels, and they were used by Special Forces, as far as I can tell, well, as long as they used paper one-time pads, but at least 10, 12 years, up to maybe around the 2000s. Earlier this year, somebody approached me and said, have you ever heard of the Diana cipher wheel? And they showed me this picture. Some artist somewhere, a craftsman, has produced wooden versions of this cipher wheel and is selling them online. I don't know if you can see the link there, but if you Google Diana crypto system, you should come up with this. This is on Etsy. You can buy these things. I got in touch with the guy that made them because I said, the guy that showed it to me, it's like, not only am I familiar with it, I'm the inventor of it. So I got in touch with the guy that built them. He was very excited. He actually sent me a bunch of his wooden crypto devices. So there's 2 sizes of the cipher wheel. The thing in the middle is a wooden version of the Enigma machine. And the one on the bottom is, I forget what country it is, but it's like Polish or Italian or something. But it's another really cool cipher wheel. So if you want some cool paraphernalia, check that out. This is actually, I found online, a picture of an actual production version of the cipher wheel. I've got the 2 prototypes that we produced, and I have one with me. I always show it off. If you want to see it, find me later. But anyway, I was doing these things, and my boss at the time referred to me as a loose cannon, and I kind of took that as a badge of honor. I don't know if he meant that in a positive way or not, but I kind of took that as, yeah, I'm a loose cannon. I'm going to try to figure out a way to get things done and do things regardless of what the rules are. Hacker mentality. Very briefly, my second tenure, my second tour at NSA was I became a cryptanalysis intern, and I went over to the operations side of the house. I happened to be there during the first skirmish in the Desert Shield, Desert Storm, so I got to work a bunch of midnight hours, and I got a certificate for it in like a small cash board, which was really cool when I was a newlywed. I was down the road. I had originally started at a satellite location, and I went to the main campus. So if you've ever seen the aerial photos of NSA, those mysterious black buildings, I was somewhere in there. And ultimately, being an intern enabled me to get a certification as a cryptanalyst. It's really the only certification I hold. It's the only one I really care about, but again, that's another story. Certifications. So chapter 3, which is the crux of this talk today, is what I did during what it started out as my last tour of duty as an intern. I was back on the InfoSec side of the house, and I went to work for what was called the Fielded Systems Evaluation Division. In that division, the reason it existed was somebody within NSA had figured out that the way that we, NSA, very often exploited the communications and crypto of other countries and our adversaries was we took advantage of basically the systems were misused. operators would find shortcuts to bypass the crypto. They would use key that was intended to be used one time, and for whatever reason to save paper or something, they'd use it for a month. When you misuse cryptography and use it in ways other than it was intended to be designed, inevitably, very often you introduce vulnerabilities that become exploitable, and that's where the cryptanalysis kicks in. So somebody had the idea, well, gee, NSA at the time was the producer of all the crypto for all of the US, the military, the government, the DoD, State Department, and all that. We produce the best crypto in the world. We test everything, we get everything certified and approved, we do all our certification and testing on the inside, but how do we know that people that are out in the field using it are actually using it the way we intended it? Looks good on the blackboard or whiteboard, but how do we know we're using it in the field? So we had this whole office that was dedicated to going out into the field and actually meeting our customers and observing and watching how they used it to see if they were doing things that would bypass the crypto or inadvertently introduce vulnerabilities. Thought it was a great idea at the time. I was actually assigned to look at this one particular device. It was called, every crypto device has a code name. This one was called Park Hill. This one was taking an audio analog phone voice signal, converting it to digital, encrypting it, the digital portion, taking the digital stream, converting it back to analog so it could be sent over whatever channel, whatever frequency, and the process was reversed. If you used it and you were able to actually make out what the people were saying on the other end, it sounded a lot like a very choppy Donald Duck. It wasn't perfect, but it was revolutionary at the time. So I was assigned to look at it and evaluate it. But then this happened. Here's a date. Anybody know what happened on this date? This is why we're all here today. Well, more specifically, it was the release date of the first sort of publicly available web browser called Mosaic. Anybody remember Mosaic? It really literally changed the world. It was revolutionary. It's what first made the internet sort of publicly available to the masses. And of course, there had been hackers and bad guys and people doing things on the internet for many years, but it wasn't really open and out there, and people weren't aware of it. But thanks to popular movies, the awareness of it became a thing. I was in a branch or a group within this field of systems evaluation division that was focused on what we called at the time networked systems. So we were there, we were looking at mostly mainframes that were connecting to each other with workstations or dumb terminals. I guess in those days, workstations were all Unix-based. Usually they were Sun or Solaris, and everything was sort of networked. It was all Unix. In fact, in the early days, it wasn't really cybersecurity. It had a lot to do with Unix and internet security. Here's one of those sidebars. While I was doing all this, and it was really convenient because working for an organization like NSA, it was literally a 9-to-5 job because we were a classified entity. We couldn't take our work home with them, which made it convenient to leave things at work. But I was getting married, raising a family, having kids. But back at the day job, there was a small group of us that were working in this networked systems group, and we started learning about the web, and we were going on to Mosaic and searching and finding out all these cool things, and we were having this thought, similar time frame to what Chris had talked about during his keynote this morning. This was sort of early to mid-90s. But we're like, hey, we should try to figure out how to break into things and do it hacker style, do it the way we've seen it in the movies. One of our main inspirations, anybody's heard of this book, The Cuckoo's Egg? This is Clifford Stahl that was, I believe he's an astronomer by training, works at a university. Back in those days when you were getting on the computer, which was a mainframe to do whatever work you were doing, you had to pay for your time. He was reviewing the bill, the monthly bill he got one time, and noticed a discrepancy, and that led to him discovering that the university mainframes which were doing a lot of government work, had been compromised by East German hackers, Iron Curtain, Soviet Union, all sorts of cool stuff. And they made a movie about it, and it was premiered on a show called Nova. I don't know if anybody remembers Nova. I don't know if it's still on or not, but educational television back in the day. But this kind of stuff was like, wow, we got to figure out how to do this. We got to figure out how systems can be secured by breaking into them. It was kind of cool. It was kind of fun. It was kind of edgy, and more on that later. I actually had the privilege earlier this year of meeting Cliff Stahl, which was kind of cool. And we were at a conference up in Canada. So there's going to be several of these things. I've had a fun year meeting all of my heroes from back in the day. But anyway, what the government likes to do when they come up with an idea of seeing something new, and we were kind of doing things, sort of at the worker bee ranks, but the management was thinking lofty and higher, so they reorganized, and they formed this thing called the Systems and Network Attack Center. So the small group of us that had been starting to tinker with learning how to break into primarily Unix systems, how to hack systems, we got pulled into this group, and we actually were put into a division. Everything at NSA is letters and numbers, so we were put into an office called C4, which we thought was kind of cool. This was designed to be a center of excellence. It was one of the first centers of excellence that NSA produced. So there was, it was done by the management, the suits we like to call them, and so it was a very intellectual, very research-oriented type of organization. And we were put in it, but we were trying to be different. We were trying to be edgy. We were trying to be hackers and sort of live and think that mentality and come up with a pen testing methodology. So we sort of formally pulled together and started a team. The deputy director at the time, he had this sort of naive vision, and he thought, all we need is a bunch of these long-haired, young, weird type of people together, and if we get them together, we'll just rule the world, and we'll be the best that there is. And we tried to educate them that there's a few thousand of these types of people out there, and no subgroup would ever be able to compete against the masses that were available out there. But it got us reorganized. They put us into an office, so we were together. And one of the first things we tried to do, now that we sort of had an organization and budget and a mission, was we wanted to learn. So at the time, what the organization that was sort of leading, at least within the DoD, was the Air Force. The Air Force, for whatever reason, sort of owned the internet for the military. They were basically the sysadmins for the entire internet presence, networking presence for the DoD. So they set up the first Network Operations Center, which led to, shortly thereafter, the first Security Operations Center, and this was all based down in San Antonio, Texas. They had an organization at the time that was called the Air Force Information Warfare Center. So we knew them to be sort of the elite and the premier. They were leading edge, and so we took a trip. We wanted to go learn from them, so we took a trip to San Antonio. We met a couple guys there, these two captains. So on the left is Captain Zeiss. He unfortunately passed away about 2 years ago. And on the right, Captain Waddell. These guys, again, leading edge. They and a bunch of their cohorts left the Air Force. They went on to start a company called Wheel Group, which was, I believe, more or less credited as being the first commercial security vendor company out there. And like many security companies that were leading edge at that time, they very quickly got snatched up by some larger company. They actually were acquired by Cisco. Whenever I meet somebody from Cisco as an aside, I ask them, why are you here? Cisco is not a security company, but they've been trying to be a security company for a very long time. Anyway, not to dig on Cisco, but So San Antonio, has anybody ever been to San Antonio? Wonderful place. At the time, they had an Air Force museum with a lot of planes. Anybody know what plane this is? Recently declassified when we got down there, so this was the first time we had seen this plane. And this, anyone, this one? A-10 Warthog. This was what kind of won that skirmish in the desert. And of course, we had the usual sightseeing stuff, including the river walk and, of course, the 46-ounce margarita. Only have one of them. I was in San Antonio, we were on the Riverwalk. We had just had some big, huge steak dinner and then drinking the 46-ounce margarita. And I called home to talk to my wife, and she's like, you know, how are you doing? And I said, oh, I just had a steak and I had this margarita. And she's like, great, I'm home with the 4 kids and we just split a can of tuna fish. So it was very important in my off time to make sure I took care of the family and take them on vacations. So we did a lot of vacationing, as an aside, hacker mental health. Our biggest takeaway from the Air Force visit was 2 things. One was these guys were smart, but they weren't any smarter than us. We were sort of on the same page in terms of learning about attack methodologies and what kind of exploits were out there in the wild and sort of the way you did things back then. But what was significant to us was their physical office structure. What do they call that? Feng shui? Something like that? They had, instead of regular old cubicles stacked up, they'd pushed everything to the corners, and they literally had a round table in the middle of their office. And the way that they set it up was, you know, everybody's doing their own thing, but if anybody had a problem that they wanted to sort of collaborate with, they'd call round table, and everybody would turn and come to the middle. And we thought that was really cool, so we emulated that. Of course, we had to have our own space to do that. And we set ourselves up in an office. We had the whole round table scenario. We were trying to live the hacker mentality, the hacker culture, so we nicknamed our office and we called it the Pit. The Pit was an office that existed in an NSA facility that was just west of BWI Airport, and the Pit was actually in this building here in the corner. I think it was in the 2nd or 3rd floor. The reason I bring this up is because several years ago a book came out called Dark Territory, The Secret History of the Cyber War. In the 4th chapter, which is entitled Eligible Receiver, there's the following paragraph, which I like to do a dramatic reading. I'm going to do it like this because I can't read that small print. In the middle there, during its most sensitive drills, the red team worked out of a chamber called the Pit, which was so secret that few people at NSA knew it existed, and even they couldn't enter without first passing through 2 combination locked doors. So our office was the Pit. Somehow it got evolved into folklore. We didn't have double locked doors. We were just an office. We were an office with cubicles and a round table in the middle of the room. But somehow that transcended. One of the members of the Pit, one of the people I used to work with, bought the book, read this. They took a picture of the paragraph and sent it out to all of us. And like, we're famous, we're in a book. So the Pit really, at the end of the day, was 6 people. There were 6 guys that were working together, trying to learn how to do hacking, ethical hacking, penetration testing. We actually, at the time, called it vulnerability and threat assessment. So we tried to develop a methodology. They didn't exist back then. There were no SANS courses. There was no certified ethical hacker, none of it. We were just kind of shooting from the hip, trying to come up with things. Of course, we were doing this at NSA, and that immediately caused several issues because, A, it was something different, and NSA at the end of the day, and still to this day, to my knowledge, is a pretty conservative organization. It's also a bureaucracy. It is, at the end of the day, government, and things typically don't move very quickly within government. You know, Chris mentioned how long he's been trying to get his company through the FedRAMP program. It's not efficient if you're into speed, and we were trying to live the hacker culture, which moves fairly quickly, so that caused conflict, let's just say. The biggest conflict is we wanted to break into things, but to get authorization to do this thing that was kind of different and weird, and also, by the way, was sort of against the charter of NSA, which basically, if I can sum it up, because it's still, I think, a classified document, NSA is only supposed to do what NSA does to foreign nationals, to other countries, other citizens. NSA is not allowed to do what NSA does to US citizens. And a whole nother talk and discussion that we could have about Snowden and all that kind of stuff. But that's sort of the genesis of it, is NSA is not supposed to do that. But we can do it if we follow rules, and the rules would take weeks to get done, where all we wanted to do was break into something, and we knew it could only take a couple seconds. we came up with a methodology. I think the methodology hasn't changed a whole lot because there's a way that you try to break into things. You first do some sort of reconnaissance. We called it recon. These days it's called open source intelligence. But you have to learn about your target. And once you learn about your target, you try to zone in and try to find the weak spots. And you try to find the weak spots in various ways. And once you find the weak spots, you try to exploit them, so on and so forth. To try to help put this in context, because I go to a lot of these conferences and I hear lots about pen testing, how it's done these days, and I think, again, even Chris referred to the amount of automation that's out there these days. I want to just remind you of what we did not have available to us when we were discovering all this. So this is not a concise list. This is not a comprehensive list, but this is just to give you some examples. We were doing it manually primarily. There were some rudimentary tools here and there that became available. I'll share some of you, but the stuff that we take for granted as pen testers these days more or less just did not exist. By the way, I tried to get together with my family on holidays, and we would do fun things like go to the pumpkin patch and all that kind of stuff. And I'd dress up as Santa. Now I do Santa very well. Anyway, told you about what we didn't have. I want to share a little bit about what we did have. And again, it was all manual, and we were sort of making it up as we went along. I want to give you a disclaimer now. The way the rules were at the time, anytime we targeted a system, and very often the system was a network, everything we did had to be classified at the level of the target. So if we were going after a top secret network or a top secret server or top secret system, everything we had to do was top secret. And since we were NSA and our charter was to take care of and monitor and inspect and secure the classified networks, very often everything we were doing was classified, which to my knowledge hasn't been unclassified. So what I will say to you is, I'm not saying we were using any of this stuff I'm about to share with you. I'm going to say that this was stuff that was commonly available at the time. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. I did this at a conference in Baltimore, BSides Charm, and somebody like interrupted me and was like, I work there, you can't do this, stop. And I'm like, it's a joke. So disclaimer, this is a joke. We had network sniffers. They were hardware. They weighed 20 or 30 pounds, and we'd wheel them around on carts, and we would plug them into the network devices, and we would do what was called sniffing the network. Nowadays, you have Wireshark and things like that. We had the rudimentary beginnings of a vulnerability scanning tool. One of the first ones out there that was publicly available as open source was a program called Satan. You can see what it stands for. Again, I had the pleasure, I think it was last November, since I'm involved with Security Weekly, we were able to arrange to have the developers of Satan on the air for an interview. A very special moment. We got to talk to Vitsa Venema and Dan Farmer. So fanboy moment for me. And I'll say this in terms of a fanboy as an aside. These guys are in it for the passion of the craft. They try to help people have more secure networks. They had an opportunity very early on to commercialize and make people pay for their product, and they opted to keep it open source. Not to make a value judgment, but I've always thought that was kind of cool that they just didn't see the dollar signs and run for it like a certain other person did that came out with a contemporary vulnerability scanning tool, which is not to disparage that person, and I won't say who it is, but you make your life choices. I'm just going to suggest that the outcome isn't always money that makes for a satisfying career and however we define success. Sometimes doing the right thing and educating and helping people be a little bit better off can be pretty darn satisfying too. Another date. 1, 2, 3. Nobody's going to get any of these. This is when something called BugTrack came out. Anybody ever hear of BugTrack? Remember BugTrack? Is it still around? I don't do this stuff actively anymore. BugTrack was at the time one of the primary sources of vulnerability information. If you were working on a system or a particular application or operating system and you wanted to learn about what people knew about it in terms of its operation, particularly vulnerabilities, people would write into this email mailing list, and it became an archive, and you could respond. It's an old-fashioned way of communicating, which is only 25 years old. It was a primary resource for us, and we used to go to the pool, and I used to have hair. So this is an example of what BugTrack looks like, and again, it was an email format. People would write a question, and then people would respond to it, and BugTrack had the ability to just sort of thread everything together. So it didn't work perfectly, but if you had a topic, it had the ability to help you find who's talking about it and what they were saying. One of the other things we had as a primary source of information was advisories that were published by the Computer Emergency Response Team. You know, this was tracking real-world hacker activity. Look out, there's bad guys doing something somewhere. If anybody can read the small print on that, check the date and check what the vulnerability is about. This was a real advisory that they put out about a virus, alien operating systems being vulnerable to a virus. They had a sense of humor back then. Some samples of OSINT. Again, we called it more reconnaissance back then. There were basically databases. Most of the internet back then were databases that had some sort of rudimentary search engine built into it. There was FAQs that were available. There wasn't much to go on. Archie was one of the search engines that could look up mostly university-connected databases to see what information is out there. The Internet was a way to look up domain registrations, who owned what and what address space. Gopher is another search engine. Before Google, there was this kick-ass search engine called Alta Vista. Anybody remember Alta Vista? Anybody still think it's better than, anyway. Netscape came along as a browser. You know, as more people put more things on the internet, things became more browser friendly. And then the original browser, Yahoo, not the one that exists today, but the original. Anybody remember the original Yahoo browser? So old. We would try to acquire targets. Back in those days, everything was internet routable. The private addressing wasn't really a thing. If you wanted to be on the internet, you had an IP address and you had to register your network segment. They were categorized in domains and so on and so forth. But if you found a target, you wanted to do a port scan. The port scanner that we had available to us at the time was something called Strobe. Interesting trivia note about this thing called Strobe, which I didn't realize until I was putting the talk together because I was trying to look up when things came out. Anybody have any idea who wrote Strobe? Julian Assange. When I saw that, I was like, that's why I recognized the guy's name. Totally forgotten it. I hadn't looked at Strobe in 20 years. Brownie points for getting the answer right. Somebody get him a beer. You'd have to look up, you had a target, you'd look up what their registration was, what their domains were, what their addressing space was. You'd use NS lookup, and you could look up the targeted account, the IP addresses or the network segments, and you get all sorts of fun information like the name of the administrator that set up the account, and you could usually figure out what his user ID was, and then, surprise, surprise, guessing passwords back in those days was a thing, but that's been solved now, so passwords have moved on. We had tools that would actually do mapping of the networks to figure out the topology, and it would actually do a little bit of sort of what we call traffic analysis. Look who's talking to who and look who's talking to what. And back in those days, there's this concept of client-server, where the server was running the application and the clients would just attach with sort of an interface. So the server is what you wanted to go after typically. That's where the perceived crown jewels were, the juicy targets. And you could figure that out with network mapping. Another date. Anyone? This is when the password cracking program came out that was cleverly entitled Crack. Again, back in those days, to get the passwords, you only had to go to the password file, etc password. This is an actual snapshot of an actual password file, not from the NSA days, because that would have been classified, but this is one that I pulled shortly thereafter. So You've got the user ID, you got a colon, you've got this weird string, which is the hash of the passwords. This used to be world readable by anybody on the system. So you could just go grab it, run crack, pop, and recover password after password after password. Again, passwords have been solved now, so that's not a problem anymore. Back in those days, basically the methodology was to get anywhere on any system within the network, and once you had some sort of user access level, because these were all pretty much Unix systems, the next goal was to get root. If you got root, it was game over. It's the equivalent to getting the domain admin access these days in the Windows world. A very common technique for elevating your privileges to root was finding programs that were running on the system with what was called setuid or setuid 0. What that basically meant was the program was running as if it was running on the root account. And if you could halt the interruption of that thing, very often it would dump out into a shell but retain the characteristics of what it was running as. So very often you would dump out into a root shell. So find a program running setuid, figure out how to break it or halt its operation, make it choke somehow, and very often it would just dump out into a root shell. You had root, and you did the root dance, and you were done. So I mentioned, so that's some of the tradecraft. Back to what we were trying to do. I mentioned that we had some growing pains, we had some problems, and one of the key problems was this thing, as I mentioned earlier, the NSA charter, which I can't show to you because it's still classified. But again, essentially, the essence of it is NSA doesn't do what NSA does to US citizens. Another date, anyone? Anybody know about PGP? So, I have a story to tell about this, but in the interest of time, I will skip it. Ask me about my NSA PGP story if you see me somewhere out today or this evening, especially if you put a drink in my hand. I'd be happy to tell you the story. Another fun fan moment for me is I got to meet the actual Phil Zimmerman last fall. He's a real geek. I mean, among geeks, he's a real geek. But it was really cool to meet him. So we had this issue of we weren't supposed to be doing things that, to citizens, and we were trying to do this ethical hacking, breaking in first before the bad guys did. I want to share with you one reveal of one top secret thing that we did. So this doesn't leave the room. You don't really have to pause the video. But here's one of our primary attack tools back in the day. I'm gonna let that sink in a minute. It's funny, the ping command. We had our lawyers, our general counsel, rule on the ping command and say their interpretation was because the ping command issues or elicits, they used lawyer language, elicits a response from the target, we have to therefore classify it as an attack tool, therefore it has to be considered classified. So quite literally, before we could issue a ping command, we would have to go through the weeks-long process of getting 10, 15, 20 signatures from all sorts of various levels of management, half of which didn't even know who we were or what we were doing. It could take weeks, if not months, to wait to issue a ping command. Now, grant you, we never really waited to issue the ping command, but at some point we had to wait for the paperwork to catch up to us. This wasn't going to work. This wasn't going to work in terms of building any kind of reasonable methodology that we could go out and do this thing to this ethical hacking, this pen testing, what we called a vulnerability threat assessment to any of our customers, which was primarily the DoD, the military, State Department, anybody running a classified network. So we had to engage with the lawyers. For whatever reason, I thought, I can do this. I have a brother that's a lawyer. I felt like I could speak their language, so I sort of volunteered to take on the assignment of trying to educate the lawyers and work with them on figuring out a way to sort of streamline this process, because it's ridiculous to have to wait 6 weeks to issue a ping command. So the original idea was the lawyer said, well, why don't you just show us all your different attacks and we'll sort of pre-approve them, so when you have an assignment or you have a new job, you'll just sort of fill out an a la carte menu. We're going to do a couple pings here, we're going to couple this over here, and they'd be like, oh yeah, we know what that is, we approve it, and we'll streamline the process. And I tried to explain to them, well, that doesn't really work because we don't often know what we're going to encounter until we start doing the reconnaissance or the open source intelligence gathering. We don't know what we're up against. We don't know what the potential weaknesses are that we might want to exploit until we start doing the job. So I tried to emphasize to them that we needed to think more about the methodology and the process and not so much focus on the tools and the techniques. So we embarked on what I called at the time a weekly meeting with the general counsel to teach them hacking techniques, to teach them the methodology, to just show them how it worked. And I called it Tool Time because there was this popular show on at the time called Home Improvement, where the show within the show was Tool Time. And again, I also found time to spend time with the family because it was important to take time off. So we would go on field trips and go on outings. And I did get to know my kids, and I think they mostly liked me, even though they're adults these days. But meanwhile, back at the day job, we started doing this. It was new, it was different. People were connecting to the internet in all sorts of new and different ways. So we became popular. We were doing our thing within our little world, the DoD military classified world, but somehow word got out. And this will be a very abbreviated story, but somehow the Department of Justice got wind that NSA had this group of people that were doing this ethical hacking, pen testing type of thing, and they said, we want you to do that to us. Well, at the time, NSA was doing what it did to classified networks. The organization that was responsible for the unclassified networks of the government was an organization called Nist. You've all heard of Nist. It was also well understood at the time, and I will disavow this if you share with people, but Nist was very generally understood to not have much in the way of capability at the time, so they would often defer to us anyway. So again, there was this bureaucratic, political red tape process that we had to go through. And so we were approached by the DOJ, we want you to do this. I had to go to the lawyers and say, how do we make this happen? And launch this months-long process where basically what it boiled down to was it was sort of a handshake, sorry for the sexist language, gentleman's agreement between cabinet member positions within the government. So the secretary, what do they call him? The attorney general for the DOJ had to talk to the person in charge of the DOD, which was designated to the deputy director that was responsible for all this internet type stuff. But they had to request, hey, can you have NSA do this for us? So back and forth at this high level, I was responsible for writing a lot of the letters, and other people would do that, like the lawyers, get all the language right, and then it would go for the signatures. But this letter actually came in, signed by the Attorney General at the time, Janet Reno, and asking for the help. And the response was eventually published, signed by the director of NSA at the time. You can see I'm actually named in it as the point of contact. We were going to do a security assessment, a vulnerability and threat assessment of the DOJ. And before this letter could be sent, this happened. This was the first compromise, the first hack of a government website. And back then, it was all website hacking. And so that whoever did it, I'd still like to meet them to this day because we never figured out who it was, but I suspect that I've probably met them at some point. But they came in and defaced the NSA website. You could scroll down. You can find this on like the Internet Archives, Hacker Archives. Just Google the DOJ hack. You scroll down and you get into some NSFW stuff, so I'm not going to put it up here. To make a long story short, it was hacked. We figured out a way to go down. So I took the first forensics team that NSA had, and of course, we didn't know what we were doing. Nobody did at the time. The DOJ had what most people had in those days, a web server that was running on one of their own servers in their own DMZ. There was no co-hosting or cloud or anything like that. And as soon as they discovered that they'd been hacked, they pulled the plug, wiped the whole system, and rebuild it with an operating system, you know, thus wiping out whatever forensic evidence there might have been. Whole nother topic, but essentially we were doing something that somebody in the political position got wind of, and we were down there for, I had led a team to go down there. We were down there for 2-3 days when I got a phone call from somebody in the pit saying, the shit's hit the fan, drop what you're doing and come back. We came back, we got marched into the conference room for the Deputy Director of Information Security, so we were in the big paneled building with the big long table, and the lawyer that I'd been working with came in and proceeded to read us the Riot Act, that we had done some gravely illegal thing. Don't you know about the NSA charter? Don't you know about the church proceedings? I'm not going into that, but the second time I ever heard about the church proceedings was Snowden. I give a talk where I go into detail on this that I have entitled, I Was the First Edward Snowden. Again, put a drink in my hand, I'll tell you the story later. The upshot was we got into a lot of trouble because I was the ringleader. Everything kind of fell on me because somebody's got to be the scapegoat. But in a positive light, because we became familiar with forensics, one of the first publications that SANS did was one on incident handling, and I was a contributing editor to that. But at the end of the day, after all sorts of bad things happened, the members of the pit were again paraded into the conference room, and we were told by our senior management, look, we really like what you guys are doing. You know, we want you to do what you guys are doing, but if you're going to do it here, you kind of have to do it following our rules. And we were hackers, so we left. Most of us. So there were 6 of us originally. 2 of us are still at NSA doing all sorts of wonderful things that I don't even know what they do anymore. 4 of us are out in the private sector. The only other one that I have public permission to share with is Ron Gula. Ron Gula went on to be the founder of Tenable Network Security, the makers of Nessus, and me and several other people. So that's the pit. Sort of as an aftermath, I mean, you know, this whole DOJ thing happened at the end of '96 in August. I was gone by October. Others followed shortly thereafter. Here's another date, and this is for the benefit of the Loft and Well Pond, and it's as close as I can get to, I think, was the release of LoftCrack, which was the original Windows password cracking tool. So correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but I think this is as close as I've been able to find. Also in '97, after I left, was this thing called Eligible Receiver, which you may recall was the name of Chapter 4 in the book Dark Territory, where we are, have been memorialized as being the pit. What Eligible Receiver was a joint organized NSA hack of the entire DoD. It was designed to last for something like 2 weeks, and you know, you may or may not be surprised to know they had to pull the plug on it after like 13 hours because they owned everything. And it revealed for the first time how vulnerable things were, so on and so forth. The picture on the right here is they actually got all the suits and senior level executives that were so proud of themselves for coming up with this thing. I guess for the 20th anniversary, they got them together for a symposium at University of Maryland, which would have been in 2017. That website, I think, is still active, and you can go there, and it's weird. You can't Google search, but if you go there, you can find a link to, they have a roundtable discussion where they talk about Eligible Receiver. They also published a redacted version of sort of a promotional video that they did about Eligible Receiver that they produced back in 1997. It was originally a 20-minute video, and they redacted it down to, it's like 11 minutes. You can, if you're clever, you can go out and find it. There's people that are in that video that I know and I worked with. So it's a little interesting piece of history, but it happened after sort of the time of the pit. Another fun date, just again to put these things in context, Nmap didn't come out until after I had left NSA. So just everything we did at NSA in the early days was done without Nmap, can you imagine? We still get together less frequently now. We try to do it as often as we can, and a recent gathering of the original members of the pit, somebody that still works at NSA brought us a whole bunch of tchotchke from NSA. So I got a bottle of NSA secret sauce. I've never tried it, I'm not gonna open it. And then we got this really cool NSA pen that actually emits the NSA seal as sort of a bat signal, which is what's being projected on that coffee mug. So that's not a seal on the coffee mug, that's what the pen produces. You can find this stuff at the gift shop for the NSA Cryptologic Museum, which I encourage you to meet. I encourage you to visit sometime if you're ever in Fort Meade, Maryland. So that's a real high level, lots of stories. You know, I've taken all this sort of institutional knowledge, tried to turn it into a career, and at this point I try to give back and educate because I still think there's value in learning from the history of where we've come from. It's been mentioned I'm a co-host on Paul's Security Weekly, and I get to correct Paul all the time and try to provide context. We get along really well. I'm known as the PCI guy on Security Weekly, and I don't know if I've been rewarded or put in a corner yet, but they've given me my own show now, and we've just started recording since October, Security and Compliance Weekly. So I'm the main host of that. We're trying to record several episodes before we drop it on the podcast feed, so we have a little bit of, you know, something for people to listen to. But stay tuned if you're at all interested in sort of how security and compliance works together, and I would assert that they are very, very interrelated and can't be separated. Stay tuned. I'm involved with a group called Hack for Kids. They put out a game last year that's supposed to be educational called Freaker Life. It's sort of the history of hacking and freaking from the 70s and 80s and 90s. I was honored enough to be included as one of the face cards, what they call anachronisms, and this is a group of most of us together at DEF CON last year. There was a book published earlier this year called Tribe of Hackers. I guess because of my elder statesman status, they let me be in it, so I have a chapter in Tribe of Hackers. I guess right around the time of DEF CON this year, they published the second version, Tribe of Hackers Red Team, and I got to be in that. They're working on a Tribe of Hackers Blue Team. I'm not in that book, not that I have anything against the Blue Team. I'm also known as a Jedi Master. I give a talk on mastering the art of the Jedi mind trick. And I was honored enough, I guess it's been 3 years ago now, to have been included in what's called the Cabal of the Curmudgeons, which is a group of old-timers that get together at RSA every year and have dinner with Gene Spafford. Gene Spafford's one of the authors of way back at the beginning of the slide presentation, Basic Unix and Internet Security. So he wrote essentially the Bible that we used in the early days of how to secure networks. He's at Purdue University. He founded Cerias, C-E-R-I-A-S. He's a really old-timer. To be included in this group, you have to be invited in by one of the members, and you have to get voted in. Somebody has to sort of present your case, and they vote, thumbs up, thumbs down. So you might recognize some of the faces up there. It's a pretty small, quote-unquote elite group, but we call ourselves curmudgeons because we're old and generally bitter and don't pessimistic, but we haven't completely given up hope. We're still in our own way trying to organize and trying to make a difference. And ironically, the person that I have my arm around, the guy in the red sweater there, is the lawyer that I dealt with back at NSA. So we have buried the hatchet and made amends, and now we're together again. It being time for lunch notwithstanding, I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody has. Like, what's my favorite craft cocktail? Yes, in the back. Wow, that's a great question. What constitutes a security company? If Cisco isn't, I guess, is really the question. Then I have no comment. Any other questions? Like, what's my favorite alcoholic beverage? I am partial to old fashions, thank you. If we're at a beer place, I like browns and darkers. The fall ales are what I prefer. If you want to ply me later on, yes. The one that's free. Oh man, now we're going deep. I like walnut bitters. I like just about any kind of bitters. But anyway, let's go eat lunch. Thank you very much for your time. Oh, and last thing, I've got stickers. I'll put them out on the table somewhere if anybody wants stickers. More Tales from the Crypt Analyst stickers.